I have argued before the Crown's appointed arbiters. I have held the silence of men who were about to lose everything and did not yet know it. I have written rulings that ended estates, dissolved inheritances, and redirected fortunes across 3 generations. And I have signed my name beneath them without a tremor, because I was certain, and certainty was the one thing I had never lacked. I tell you all of this so that you understand what it cost me to admit that for 2 years I had been signing someone else's work. Her name was Myra Ashwell. She sat at the far end of my table and copied documents for a living. Stern House in those years was a peculiar sort of institution, not a court, not a firm, not a ministry, though it drew from all 3. The Crown had need, in the succession disputes following the old king's decline, of a private arbitration cabinet, men who could read a contested will, a disputed entail, a forged conveyance deed, and render a confidential judgment that would hold. I was appointed its head because I was known to be rigorous, because I had no political debts, and because, I will not pretend otherwise, I frightened people into honesty. My panel consisted of myself and 2 other men, Aldous Fenn, a gray-haired solicitor of 30 years standing who knew every precedent and could recite them in his sleep, and Reginald Chalk, younger, sharper, a man who had a gift for finding the one sentence in a document of 300 pages that changed everything. We were good. We knew we were good. We had a record of 31 arbitrations without a successful challenge. The copyist was not part of the panel. She was a practical necessity. Our work produced enormous quantities of paper, and a fair-hand copyist who could render our arguments legibly and in proper legal form was essential. The position had previously been held by a man named Peel, who had retired. He was replaced, on Fenn's recommendation, by the widow of a solicitor named Ashwell, who had apparently been keeping her late husband's files in order for the last decade and could be relied upon to be discreet. I paid very little attention to how that change was made. I believe I signed an authorization without looking up from what I was reading. She was brought in on a Thursday in early October. I noted her presence the way I noted the presence of a new chair. She was there, she was quiet, and she did not interfere with my thinking. She sat at the far end of the long mahogany table with her copying materials arranged in a precise line, ink, quill, sander, blotter, and she transcribed what Fenn and Chalk dictated to her, and what I occasionally directed, and she asked no questions, made no errors, and was never late. That was, I told myself, exactly what one wanted in a copyist. For 3 months I was entirely correct. The first case of the winter was the Draven succession matter, a tangled affair involving a disputed codicil, 2 half-brothers, and a question of whether a modification made to a will in 1791 had been properly witnessed under the relevant statute. Chalk found the key date. Fenn supplied the precedent. I wrote the ruling. Myra Ashwell copied it. We sent the packet to the Crown's representative on a Friday morning. On Monday, the packet came back. I stood in the hall and held it because packets did not come back. In 31 arbitrations, no ruling of ours had been returned. I broke the seal with a steadiness that I did not entirely feel and removed the papers, expecting a challenge, a political intervention, some interference from one of the half-brothers' advocates. Instead, I found a single line from the Crown's representative, a man named Aldwych, dry as old bone and twice as hard to move, in his cramped, unmistakable hand. Before you proceed, you may wish to examine the enclosure. The enclosure was one of our own pages. Specifically, it was the 3rd page of the ruling, which contained Fenn's statutory argument. And in the margin of that page, in a hand I did not recognize, fine, exact, unhurried, and utterly without apology, were 3 lines. The 1791 statute cited here was superseded in the relevant particular by the 1794 Act, Clause 7, which Fenn and Chalk appear not to have consulted. The correct precedent is Merrow v. Driscoll, 1796, which in fact supports the ruling's conclusion but must be cited in place of the statute or the challenge will hold. I have left the correction in the margin rather than alter the text, as that is not my place. I read it twice. Then I went to the cabinet and pulled our copy of the document. There, in the same fine hand, in the same margin, were the same 3 lines. She had made the correction in our copy at the same time she made it in the fair draft, and she had sent the fair draft without telling any of us. She had not altered the text. She had written in the margin. She had not signed it. That is not my place. I stood in the library for a long time. Then I went and found Finn and showed him the page. He turned the color of old paper and said, after a moment, that the widow must have misunderstood something, that she must have seen some note of his own, and I held up my hand and he stopped talking. I told him to pull the 1794 Act in the Marrow case. He did. They said exactly what the margin note said they said. I corrected the ruling. We resubmitted, Aldwych passed it without comment. I did not say anything to Myra Ashwell. I did, however, begin to look at the documents on her copying desk when she was not in the room. It was not an admirable thing to do, and I knew it even as I did it. But I was not looking for evidence of wrongdoing. I did not know what I was looking for precisely. Some explanation. Some way to account for 3 lines of legal analysis that were cleaner than anything Finn had produced that quarter. I found nothing in the documents on her desk that first time. She kept her work in perfect order. The original, the fair copy beside it, the ink dry, the pages numbered. No additional notes, no marginalia. I went back to the Draven file and looked at every page. The margins of the pages she had copied were clean. The correction was only on page 3, the Finn page. I pulled the pages preceding and following it. Nothing. I pulled the pages of the copy she had retained in the cabinet file, which by protocol was kept separately from the sent copy. On page 7, a page of my own writing, there was a single pencil mark. Not a word. A bracket drawn very lightly beside a passage in which I had cited a date with a small question mark beneath it. I looked at the date I had cited. I checked it against the original instrument. I had transcribed it incorrectly. Chalk had missed it in his review. Finn had not caught it. I had signed it without checking my own source. The date in my copy was the 13th. The date in the original instrument was the 30th. The difference did not affect the ruling as it happened, but it was an error, and she had seen it, and she had marked it in pencil, so lightly it was nearly invisible, and said nothing. She had not wanted to embarrass anyone. She had simply marked it so that, if someone looked, they would find it. I erased the pencil mark. I corrected the date in our retained copy, and then I sat in the library for considerably longer than I had the first time. After that, I pulled every file she had touched since October. I did this over 3 evenings, working alone after Finn and Chalk had gone home. Stern House at night was very quiet, the coals settling in the grate, the occasional sound of the street outside, the particular stillness of a room full of paper that no one is currently reading. I worked by lamplight, pulling packets from the shelves in reverse chronological order, and I went through every page she had copied. What I found was not dramatic. There were no wholesale reconstructions, no brilliant revelations. There was a pencil bracket here, a small question mark there, one marginal note similar to the Draven correction on a document from November, a brief, precise identification of a missing citation, again unsigned, again framed as an observation rather than a correction, again noting that altering the text was not her place. But there was also something subtler, which took me longer to identify. In several of the later files, November, December, a January packet, the fair copies she had produced were not merely accurate transcriptions of what had been dictated. In 2 cases, the phrasing of a passage she had copied had shifted slightly from the original dictation note, not in substance, but in legal precision. A phrase that Chalk had used loosely had been tightened. A clause of Fenn's that had been technically ambiguous had been rendered in a form that was not ambiguous. She had not changed the meaning. She had clarified the expression. And she had done it so quietly, so exactly within the boundaries of what a careful copyist might creditably claim, that it was possible, barely possible, to believe it had been accidental. It was not accidental. I sat back in my chair on the third evening and looked at the lamp and thought about what I was looking at. I was looking at a woman who understood the law. Not in the way a well-read person might understand it, not as a set of general principles or familiar cases. She understood it as a practitioner understands it. The statutes, the precedents, the technical precision of language, the difference between a clause that will hold and a clause that will fail when challenged. She understood it, I estimated, as well as Fenn, and in at least two respects that I had identified, she had seen things that Fenn had not. She was not a copyist. Or rather, she was a copyist because she had no other available form. I thought about her late husband, a solicitor's widow, Fenn had said, keeping his files in order for a decade. A decade of a solicitor's files, every brief he had written, every case, every letter of advice, every contract, every deed, read, organized, understood, and kept, because that was the job and because there was no other job she was permitted to hold. I put the files away and went to bed and did not sleep particularly well. I said nothing to her for another 3 weeks. This was not evasion. I was deciding how to proceed, and I did not wish to proceed badly. If I confronted her without having thought it through, one of two things would happen. She would deny it and we would both be in an untenable position, or she would admit it and I would have to decide in the moment what to do about Fenn and Chalk and the protocols of the cabinet, and I was not prepared to do that without having thought through the consequences. In the meantime, I watched her. I did not do this obviously, or I hope I did not, though looking back I am not certain I was as subtle as I believed. I watched her at the table during our working sessions, the way she held herself still when Chalk read aloud a passage she had clearly already read. The way her eyes moved when Fenn cited a precedent, not following him, but checking him, and the small, precisely controlled nothing that happened in her expression when he got it slightly wrong. She never corrected him aloud. She never even glanced at her own notes. She simply absorbed the error and moved on. I began routing the harder packets to her end of the table. I did this gradually, so that it did not appear deliberate. A packet would arrive and I would say, without looking up, that the Ashwell copy should go to Mrs. Ashwell first for preliminary organization, and Fenn would nod absently, and Chalk would not notice, and the packet would travel to the far end of the table and spend 2 or 3 hours in her proximity before it reached Fenn's hands. When it reached Fenn's hands, it was always in slightly better order than it had arrived. I do not think Fenn noticed. He was not, at heart, a noticing sort of man. He trusted the precedents he already knew and was suspicious of new information, which is a quality that has its uses in a solicitor of 30 years' standing and its considerable limitations. Chalk noticed. I could see that he noticed, in the way a clever young man notices when the rules of a room have shifted without anyone saying so. He did not say anything either. He watched me watch her, and he kept his own counsel, and he was, I think, curious. I recognized, doing something that did not have a name. I was not testing her. I already knew what she could do. I was not studying her. I had already studied her for 3 weeks. I was doing something more like what a man does when he has found an unexpected thing and cannot stop looking at it, not because he is uncertain of what it is, but because he is still reckoning with what it means that it exists. She was remarkable, and she was sitting at the end of my table copying documents. The Harwick case broke in February, and that was when I stopped waiting. It was the most complex matter we had handled. A contested succession involving 3 instruments, 2 of them potentially fraudulent, a disputed signature, and a question of legal capacity that required not only precedent but an understanding of chancery procedure that neither Fenn nor Chalk had in depth. I had handled chancery matters before, but not in recent years, and the relevant procedures had been modified by a 1799 amendment that I had not, to my discomfort, read as carefully as I should have. We spent 4 days on the initial brief. On the 5th day I came in earlier than my usual hour, early enough that the coals were not yet fully lit, and the winter light was thin and gray through the long windows, and found Myra Ashwell already at her place at the end of the table. She looked up when I entered. She did not look alarmed to be found there early, the way a person caught in something they should not be doing might look. She looked the way she always looked, composed, precise, present. She had a document open before her and a pencil in her hand, and she set the pencil down with the particular deliberateness of someone who has decided, in the moment of being observed, exactly what they are going to do. I said, "Mrs. Ashwell." She said, "Your Grace." I said, "What are you reading?" There was a pause, a short one, the kind that contains a decision. She said, "The Chancery Amendment of 1799. I obtained a copy from the public record. I thought it might be relevant to the Harwick matter." I pulled out the chair at the head of the table, which was my chair, and I sat down, and I looked at her across the length of the mahogany table. I said, "Is it relevant?" She said without hesitation, "Yes." Section 4 modifies the earlier procedure in a way that affects how we frame the capacity question. If we use the old framing, the challenge will have grounds. If we use the corrected framing, it does not. I said, "Write it out." She looked at me. I said, "Not as a margin note. Write it out fully in a memorandum, as you would if you were advising the panel. Your name at the top." The pause this time was longer. I watched something move through her expression, not fear, not calculation, but something closer to the feeling of stepping off a ledge one has been standing beside for a very long time. She said, "That is not customarily." I said, "I am aware of what is customary. I am asking what I asked." She looked at me for another moment. Then she took a fresh sheet of paper. She picked up the pencil, and she began to write. She wrote for 40 minutes without stopping. I did not read over her shoulder. I worked at my end of the table, or I held the appearance of working, which is not quite the same thing. I read the same paragraph of the Harwick instrument perhaps 6 times without absorbing it, because the scratch of her pencil at the far end of the room was doing something to my concentration that I could not entirely account for. When she finished, she rose, walked the length of the table, and placed the memorandum before me. I read it. It was 9 pages. It was the clearest, most precisely constructed legal analysis I had read since. I tried to remember when I had last read something of its quality. My own work at my best, perhaps. The work of a judge I had once clerked under, 30 years ago, who had been considered the finest legal mind of his generation. She had identified not only the Chancery Amendment and its implications for the capacity question, but 2 subsidiary issues in the second contested instrument that Fenn had not flagged, and a question of attestation in the third that, if left unaddressed, would give the opposing party grounds for a procedural challenge even if the substantive ruling was correct. She had also, in a final paragraph set off by a clear space, identified one potential weakness in her own analysis, a counterargument that could be made, and addressed it. She had addressed the weakness in her own argument. She had found it herself and answered it herself. I set the memorandum down on the table. I said, "How long have you known?" She said, "I beg your pardon." I said, "How long have you known that you were doing this, doing work that was not being attributed to you?" Another pause, the longest one yet. She said carefully, "I do the work I am given to do, Your Grace." I said, "You do considerably more than that, and we both know it. The Draven correction, The Marrow citation. The Chancery Amendment you obtained on your own time and read before any member of this panel thought to look for it. How long? She was quiet for a moment. The winter light had strengthened. It came through the window and lay across the table between us, and she stood at its edge, very still, and looked at me with an expression I could not fully read. Not defiance, not apology, something more difficult than either. She said, since October, since the Draven matter. I said, and before that, with your husband's practice. Something crossed her face, a brief, entirely private movement. She said, I kept his files. I said, for 10 years. She said, yes. I said, and you read them. She said, it was necessary to understand them in order to organize them properly. I said, Mrs. Ashwell. She met my eyes. I said, you did not simply read them, you understood them, you learned from them. And for the past 2 years, 4 months here and presumably the remainder in your husband's office before he died, you have been doing work that required that understanding and allowing other people to sign it. She said quietly, it was not my place to sign it. I said, no, it was not. Because there is no place for a woman of your ability in the structure as it currently stands, and you know that as well as I do, and so you found the margin. She did not answer, she did not look away. I said, you found the margin and you worked in it, and you were careful never to step outside it, and you did what you could from there. I picked up the memorandum. Until this morning. She said after a moment, you asked me to. I said I did. I brought the memorandum to the full panel that afternoon. I did not hide what it was or where it had come from. I set it on the table and I said that the preliminary analysis of the Harwick Chancery question had been conducted by Mrs. Ashwell and that the panel should read it and then we would discuss it. Fenn stared at me. Chalk did not stare. He looked at the memorandum and then at Myra, who was at her end of the table with her copying materials arranged in their precise line, and a small expression crossed his face that I thought might have been something close to admiration. Fenn said, surely this is, I mean to say, the copyist. I said, read the memorandum, Aldous. He read it. It took him longer than it had taken me, which was not surprising. When he finished, his color had shifted again, not the old paper gray of embarrassment, but something more complicated. He set it down and said, in a voice that had been carefully stripped of everything except its usual dryness, the Chancery analysis is sound. I said, it is. The capacity framing, the subsidiary issues in the second instrument, and the attestation question in the third, all of it stands. We will work from this memorandum. Mrs. Ashwell will be credited in the panel's working record as the originating analyst on these points. Fenn said nothing. Chalk nodded once precisely. I looked at Myra Ashwell. She was looking at the table in front of her. Not downcast, that is not the word. She was looking at it the way a person looks at something when they are trying to hold their expression steady, and the effort is taking most of their concentration. I said, Mrs. Ashwell, will you bring your notes and sit here, please? I indicated the chair to my immediate right, not the end of the table, the right hand. She looked up. I said, we have a Harwick ruling to write. I would prefer to have the relevant analyst within easy consultation distance. There was a silence. Then she gathered her materials, ink, quill, sander, blotter in their precise order, and she walked up the length of the table and sat down in the chair to my right, and she set her materials out before her, and she did not say anything, and neither did I, and we got to work. The Harwick ruling took 11 days. It was the most demanding piece of legal writing the Cabinet had produced, and it was also, I will say this plainly, because it is the truth, the best. The structure was mine. The Chancery framing was hers. 2 of the subsidiary points were Chalk's. He had, when given the memorandum as a foundation, produced his best work. Fenn supplied the precedents, which was what Fenn did, and did reliably. We were, for the first time, using the full capacity of everyone in the room. She worked the way she did everything, without waste. She did not speak unless she had something to say. When she disagreed with a direction I was taking, she said so, briefly and precisely, and she was right 3 times out of 4, and when she was not right she accepted the alternative without resentment, because she was interested in the problem and not in being seen to be right about the problem. This is rarer than one might expect, even among people who are very good at what they do. On the 7th day I found her still at the table when I returned from a meeting with Aldwych that had run late. The lamps were lit. Chalk had gone. Fen had gone. She was writing by lamplight with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything, and she did not look up when I came in. I sat down at the head of the table and watched her write for a moment. I said, "Do you need more time?" She said, without looking up, "Another hour, perhaps. The attestation argument wants one more draft." I said, "I'll stay." She looked up at that. I said, "The attestation argument is the most exposed point in the ruling. If Aldwych challenges anything, it will be that. I want to read the draft when you're done." She held my gaze for a moment. Then she said, "All right," and went back to writing. I picked up the copy of the relevant statute and read it, and we worked in silence in the lamplight, and outside the window the London evening moved through its cold stages, and neither of us spoke very much, and it was one of the quieter and more unexpectedly pleasant hours I had spent in some years. When she finished the attestation draft, she slid it across the table to me. I read it. It was good. I suggested 2 alterations. She considered them, accepted one, and explained precisely why the other would in fact weaken the argument. She was correct. I withdrew the suggestion. I said, "The attestation section is sound." She said, "Yes, I think so too." I said, "You are not modest about it." She said, "I have learned not to be. When a woman is modest about her work, people take it as confirmation that the work should not be taken seriously." She paused. "Your Grace." I said, "No, you're right. Don't add the courtesy as an afterthought. I don't require it." She looked at me steadily. "What do you require?" I said, "Your analysis, your attention, your willingness to say when I am wrong." She said, "Those I can provide." I said, "I know." The Harwick ruling was submitted to Aldwych on the 22nd of the month. He held it for 4 days, the longest he had held any ruling of ours. I did not find 4 days of waiting comfortable. On the 5th morning a letter arrived, addressed to me, in Aldwich's cramped hand. It said, "The Harwick ruling is the finest piece of legal arbitration this office has received in 6 years. I would be grateful to know how the panel's methods have developed." I read it twice, then I wrote back. I told him in full how the panel's methods had developed. His next letter, which arrived 2 days after mine, said only, "I see. I should be glad to discuss the matter further at your convenience." I discussed it with him in person at his office on a Tuesday afternoon in early March. I told him about Myra Ashwell. I told him what she had been doing for 4 months in the margins of our documents, and what I had found when I had looked, and what she had produced when asked to work without constraint. I told him that the structure of a copyist's position was the only available structure, and that it was insufficient for what was required, and that something would need to be changed. Aldwych was a man who had spent his career inside a system built on precedent, and precedent did not, on the whole, include women as named legal analysts to the Crown's arbitration cabinet. He was also, and this I had always respected about him, a man who was more interested in whether something worked than in whether it had been done before. He said after a long silence, "What is the proposal?" I said, "A new position, designated legal analyst, not a copyist. The title is different, the authority is different, and the credit is properly assigned." He said, "There will be objection." I said, "From whom?" He said, "Various quarters." I said, "Leave various quarters to me." He looked at me across his desk with the expression of a man who has just decided to step off a ledge. Then he said, "Draw up the proposal." I drew it up myself that evening, in the library at Stern House. I worked until the coals were low and the lamp needed trimming, and when it was done, I set the pen down and read through it once more. Then I did something I had not planned to do. I took the draft to the far end of the table, her end, and I read it from there, sitting in her chair at her desk, with the lamp throwing the same shadows she would have seen for 4 months. The view from that chair was the same view, the long table, the shelves of documents, the head of the table where I sat, 30 feet of mahogany and 3 decades of accumulated precedent. She had seen all of it from here. She had read it, understood it, worked in its margins, and never raised her voice. I put the draft back in order and set it squarely in the middle of my own desk, where I would find it in the morning. I told her about the proposal the next day. I waited until Finn and Chalk had gone to their respective tasks, and I brought the draft to where she was working, and I sat in the chair to her left, her immediate left, which was unusual enough that she paused and looked at me, and I said, "I want you to read this." She read it. She was a fast reader, not in the way of someone skimming, but in the way of someone who processes written language the way other people process spoken conversation, quickly, completely, without needing to return. When she finished, she set it down, and she was very still for a moment. She said, "You went to Aldwych." I said, "Yes." She said, "He agreed to this." I said, "He agreed to consider it. The proposal is not yet formalized. There will be objection from several directions, and it will take some months to navigate. But Aldwych will hold, and once Aldwych holds, the rest will follow, because that is how these things work." She said, "You are certain?" I said, "I am rarely not certain." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Why?" I said, "I beg your pardon." She said, "Why did you go to Aldwych? You could have continued as we were." I was not, she paused. I was not making demands. I said, "No, you were not." She said, "Then why?" I said, "Because what was happening was wrong. The work was yours and the credit was not. That is a simple wrong, and I do not leave simple wrongs in place when I can see the correction." She looked at me. She had very clear eyes, gray, or perhaps a gray-brown. It is difficult to say with precision when one is trying not to appear to be looking as closely as one is looking. She said, "That is a legal answer." I said, "I have a legal mind." She said, "You have more than that." I said nothing. This was, for me, somewhat unusual. She said, "You sat in my chair." I looked at her. She said, "Last night. I came back for a document I had forgotten. You were sitting at this end of the table, in my chair." I said, "Oh." She said, "Why?" I considered this. I said, "I wanted to understand what you had been looking at." She said, "And did you?" I said, 30 feet of mahogany and 3 decades of cases I had closed without looking at the person who was reading them from the far end. I paused. "Yes, I think I understood it fairly well." She said quietly, "It was not so terrible, the view from here. I had the cases, I had the work. I would have preferred—" She stopped. I said, "What?" She said, "I would have preferred to be seen. Not because of vanity, because the work would have been better. 2 minds are better than 1, and 3 are better than 2, provided the 3 are actually present and not pretending to be." I said, "I know." She said, "You know now?" I said, "Yes, I know now. I am sorry it took me as long as it did to look." The silence that followed was a particular kind of silence, not uncomfortable, not empty, but the kind that happens when something that has been standing in a doorway for some time has finally decided to come through it. She said, "It was only 4 months." I said, "I looked for 3 weeks before I said anything. I should have said something in October, after the Draven correction." She said, "You needed to be certain." I said, "I am always certain." she said with a very slight change in her expression, not quite a smile, not a smile. No, you needed to be certain about something harder than a legal question. I looked at her. She held my gaze with perfect composure. The winter light was doing something particular to the papers on the desk, to the ink in the open bottle, to the precise arrangement of her materials. She was entirely present, as she always was, and entirely herself, as she always was, and I was aware, in a way I had not been managing to be unaware of for some weeks, that this was a person whose company I had been specifically routing my mornings toward, and whose absence from the room I noticed before I noticed very much else. I said, "Mrs. Ashwell." She said, "Your Grace." I said, "I am going to say something that is outside the professional scope of this conversation." She said with that almost not quite smile I had gathered that was coming. I said, "The proposal to Aldwych was made because the wrong required correcting. That is true. It is also not entirely the complete truth." I paused. "I made it because I could not imagine this room working in any configuration that did not include you at the table beside me, not at the end, beside me. And once I had admitted that to myself, the question of whether the formal structure reflected it became urgent in a way it had not previously been." She was quiet. I said, "I am telling you this because you deserve to know all of the reasons, not merely the professional ones. I'm not asking you to respond to it now. I'm asking you to read the proposal, and to tell me if there are points in the formal structure that should be altered, and to continue doing the work, because the Harwick ruling was the finest thing this cabinet has produced, and it was finest because you were in the room." I paused again. "And because I cannot seem to stop thinking about you when you are not." The winter light lay across the table between us. She said, after a moment, "The third clause in the proposal uses a phrasing that could be read as limiting the analyst's right to present arguments directly to Aldwich's office. I would change it to read, the designated analyst may correspond and present directly, not through the panel head." I said, "Done." She said, "The sixth clause ties the position to the current cabinet composition. It should be independent of any individual panel member." I said, "You're right. I'll redraft the sixth clause." She said, "The fee schedule in the addendum is insufficient." I said, "Name a figure." She named one. It was, I thought, actually slightly conservative. I said so. She raised it by 15%. I said that was more reasonable. She said, "Is there anything else you wanted to say?" I said several things, none of them legally structured. She said, "You may say them." I said, "Not yet. Not until the proposal is formalized, and you are not in a position where agreeing or disagreeing with anything I say carries a professional consequence. I will not be the sort of man who puts those two things in the same room." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "That is," she seemed to consider her word, "that is honorable." I said, "It is also somewhat frustrating." She said with that expression again, "Yes, I imagine it is." The proposal was formalized in May. It took longer than I had hoped and shorter than I had feared. There was objection from two directions. As Aldwych had predicted, one from a legal association whose opinion I had not solicited and did not require, and one from a member of the relevant ministry who had concerns that resolved themselves entirely. Once, Aldwych pointed out that the Harwick ruling had prevented a challenge that would have cost the Crown a significant amount of both time and money, and that the analyst responsible for the most important sections of that ruling was the person under discussion. The formal document, when it was signed, named Myra Ashwell as designated legal analyst to the Crown's private arbitration cabinet, with independent right of correspondence and direct presentation to the overseeing office, and with a fee schedule that she had, on second review, raised by a further 10%, which I had passed through without amendment because she was correct. I brought the signed document to the cabinet on a Thursday morning and set it on the table in front of her. She read it twice, as she had read the draft completely without skimming. When she finished, she set it down and she was very still for a moment, the way she had been when she read the draft, and the winter to spring light was coming through the long windows at an angle that was nothing like the winter light had been, softer and longer, and it did things to the room I had not quite noticed before. She said, "It's done." I said, "It's done." She said, "The sixth clause is better." I said, "It is." She said, "Thank you." I said, "The thanks go the other direction, Mrs. Ashwell." She looked up at me. I said, "I told you I had things to say that were not legally structured. The proposal is formalized. You are not in a position where your professional standing depends on your response to anything I might say outside that structure." She set the signed document down, carefully, in the precise center of her desk. She said, "Then say them." I said, "I have been thinking about this for longer than I admitted to you in February. Since January, in fact. Since I sat in this library for the third evening pulling your files and understood what I was looking at." I paused. I understood what I was looking at in a legal sense. In another sense, it took me somewhat longer because I am better with documents than with the recognition of what is happening inside my own thinking. She said, "I had noticed." I said, "I imagine you had." I looked at her. "You are the most remarkable person this cabinet has contained. You are the most precise legal mind I have worked beside since the judge I clerked under 30 years ago, who was at that point acknowledged to be the finest in England. You have more patience than any three of the rest of us combined, more honesty than is comfortable, and a way of identifying the weakness in your own argument before anyone else can find it that is, I will tell you plainly, something I have never encountered before and did not know I was looking for." She said quietly, "You are describing my professional qualities." I said, "I am getting there." She waited. I said, "I'm also not comfortable precisely but certain that I have not spent an evening in this library by lamplight with another person, working in companionable silence, and felt at the end of it that the hour had been among the better ones of recent years. I am certain that I notice when you are not in the room. I am certain that the prospect of continuing to work with you for the foreseeable future is a prospect I find." I paused. "I am not a man who pauses as a rule. Necessary. In a sense that goes beyond the professional." She said, "Callum." I had not given her leave to use my name. She had not asked for it. She said it the way a person says a thing they have been saying privately for some time and have simply decided to say aloud. I said, "Yes." She said, "I have been in this room for 7 months. I have been looking at you from the end of that table for 7 months. I have been correcting your dates in pencil and not telling you and finding it not frustrating precisely." She paused. "Fond." I said, "Fond." She said, "The sort of fond that is not entirely uncomplicated." I said, "No." She said, "I did not let myself think about it carefully. The structure did not allow for it." I said, "The structure has changed." She said, "Yes, it has." We were standing at the near end of the table, her end, where she had sat for 7 months, and the May light was coming through the window, and the room smelled of paper and sealing wax and the last of the winter's coals, and she looked at me with those clear gray eyes and did not look away, and I did not look away, and neither of us spoke for a moment. Then she said, "You said several things in February, things that were not legally structured. You have said some of them." I said, "There are others." She said, "Say them." I said, "I would like to say them over a considerable span of time, if that is agreeable, not in a single conversation. Over many years in this room and in others, by lamplight and in the mornings, and on the evenings when the Aldwych letters take 4 days to arrive, and both of us are trying not to pace." She was very still. I said, "I am not a man given to eloquence about these matters. I'm a man who can tell you precisely why the Chancery Amendment changes the capacity question, and precisely why the attestation argument in the Harwick ruling holds, and I can tell you that the hour we spent writing it together at this table was the hour in which I stopped pretending to myself that what I was feeling was merely professional respect. I paused. I love you, Mrs. Ashwell. I have loved you, I think, since I read what you wrote in the margin and understood what it meant that you had written it there and not signed it, and trusted that someone would eventually look. She said after a moment, someone did. I said eventually. She said not so very late. She held out her hand, not tentatively, not with hesitation. She held it out the way she held a pen, with precision, and with the quiet certainty of a person who has decided exactly what they mean to do. I took it. We were married in July, in the chapel attached to Stern House, with Chalk as a witness and Aldwych in attendance because he said he wished to observe, and with Fenn, who had come around in the way that people who are not naturally noticing sometimes do come around, slowly and then all at once, standing in the back row looking as though he could not quite determine how he felt about any of it but had largely decided it was all right. She kept the position. It was never a question that she would keep it. The position was hers because the work was hers, and the work did not stop because the structure around it had changed. It only got better because she no longer needed to write in the margins. There is a document from the winter of that year, the Aldwych consolidation, a matter that occupied the cabinet for 3 months and which is still cited, in which she is named as primary legal analyst in the first line of the text. Her name, her work, her analysis, unmediated, uncredited to anyone else, hers. I have a copy of that document on the shelf behind my desk. I have read the first line of it a great many times. Not because I need to, I have it, as I have everything she writes, precisely memorized, but because there is something about seeing it on the page that I have not ceased to find, after all these years, entirely remarkable. Primary legal analyst, Myra Stern née Ashwell. The woman they put at the end of the table to copy documents. The woman whose mind I have been trying to keep pace with ever since, and occasionally, on the best days, very nearly managing.